Hello, YouTube family. Welcome back. Today's episode is about powder. Everything powder that you want to know at a beginner level. So if that is something you are interested in, keep on watching. Hello, welcome. If you've not met me before, my name is Emily and I am a beauty and makeup lover. I designed this series for beginners, for people who haven't got a whole lot of experience with makeup, or people who've been using makeup for a long time but haven't nailed down the perfect look. This episode is talking all about different powders, when you should powder, what you should powder, and what types of powder you should use for your different foundations and skin types. So I am barefaced, and I am going to go ahead and put my foundation and concealer on and talk about what I'm going to powder and why. So I wanted to talk a little bit about foundation and concealer choice and whether or not you need powder or should powder for your skin type. So I am going to put on a foundation today that I do know that I have to set, and that's an important distinction. So if you're not sure if the foundation that you're using is something you need to powder down or set, put it on and leave it alone. Put it on and leave it alone for about 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, if you touch your skin and it's still a bit tacky, like when you touch your skin, if it still feels damp and tacky, like your fingers stick a little bit, or when you pull your fingers away, there's a lot of product on your fingers, that's a sign that you need to set it. However, if after 30 minutes you touch your skin and it feels dry and it just feels like your skin, and you pull your fingers away and there's very little product on your fingers, then you may not need to powder at all. So foundation choice is very important here with whether or not you need to use a powder. The other thing that is really important is your skin type. If you have an oily skin type and even after 30 minutes it feels dry and you're using a mattifying foundation, if you have an oily skin type, you know that in a few hours your oils are going to come through and there's nothing really in that foundation that's going to combat those oils, and it's going to start to break apart and slide all over your face, and it's going to look like a mess, and you're not going to have the longevity you wanted out of that foundation. So taking your skin type into account is also very important about whether or not, or even where, you should be applying powder. If you have very dry skin, you may not need powder unless you're using a super moisturizing, super emollient product like certain BB creams and CC creams. Many foundations may not need to be powdered on dry skin or at all, especially if you're looking for that dewy and glowy look. These days, with wearing a mask most of the day, I find that I have to set my foundation most of the time. Unless I'm using certain foundations, like the Estee Lauder Double Wear, I find I don't need to set that one, and it locks down pretty well into place. However, today I'm going to be using my Flower Beauty Light Illusion Foundation. I find that this foundation stays tacky enough that I need to set it, especially if I'm going to be wearing a mask. So I'm going to go ahead and put it on. I'm going to speed through this part, and then we're going to put on our concealer and talk a little bit about powder. Okay, so I've got my foundation and my concealer on, and as you can see, I'm pretty dewy. And when I touch my skin, it still feels damp. Now, I haven't let it sit for 30 minutes, but I know that this particular foundation and concealer combo, I'm using the e.l.f. Hydrating Camo Concealer, doesn't set well on me, and then I have to set it. So we're going to set the under eyes first, and you have some options here. So you can either use a loose powder or a pressed powder, and sometimes it takes a little bit of trial and error to determine which is going to look better on your skin. Now, I have sort of dry, aging under eyes. I've got some fine lines and some wrinkles. So I am looking for a powder that is very, very lightweight and thin and isn't too heavy. Now, when it comes to baking, this is not something that I find very useful in everyday life. If I'm looking to really look absolutely flawless for a photo or on video, sometimes I will use a little extra powder and let it bake to have that sort of blank canvas effect. However, it doesn't look great in everyday life. It looks a bit heavy, it looks really cakey after a while, and so I don't generally bake, but I do use powders different ways. So one of the powders that I do use under my eyes is the Charlotte Tilbury Airbrush Flawless Powder. And this powder is very expensive, but it's also very lightweight. And one of the things I love about it is that not too much comes off of the pan into the brush when you swirl your brush around. It's pressed just hard enough that you're not going to get too much product. So what I will do in this case is I will just swirl my brush around. I will tap it off to get any excess, and then I go in, and before you powder, make sure you've patted out anything that has wrinkled up already or collected underneath your eyes. If there's already a wrinkle or a spot where it has collected, when you put the powder on, you're actually going to lock that right in. So that crease, you want to make sure you pat it out with your finger. Your finger's a really great tool here because the heat from your hands will actually help sort of make the product a little more emollient and spread it out. So you press it out, and then one thing I do because of my fine lines and wrinkles is I stretch out my face, and then I apply my powder in a patting motion like this. Stretch. And I just pat lightly where I've laid that concealer down. Now this just applies slight amount of powder, and as you can see right off the bat, it has flattened that area and sort of made this circle that I've got right here look a little less prominent because there's less shine, and it doesn't look too dry and crepey. I find that this powder will make me look dry and crepey if I use too much. One of the things that I like to do after I've applied this powder, and it does work for powders that, you know, sometimes if you use a little bit too much will look a bit dry on you, is I take my damp sponge after the fact and I press the powder in. And that moisture from the sponge just takes down that dryness and then leaves me looking nice and flawless instead of powdery and crepey. So the other thing you can do, you can use loose powders underneath your eyes. There's nothing against using loose powders underneath your eyes, but you want to make sure you've got the right powders. There are lots of powders out there that are for setting that are too heavy or not finely milled enough for underneath the eyes. One of the powders that I absolutely love for using under my eyes in a very light way is the Nikia Joy Velvet Finishing Powder. Now she calls it a finishing powder, however it absolutely is a setting powder. So this is the component. One of the things I love about this powder is that it's very, very finely milled. The other thing I love about this powder is it actually does have skincare benefits in it. So over time, your skin is actually getting some additional properties than just the powder alone. And of course, it smells really, really good. And it's not an artificial fragrance. It's actually got natural fragrances in it so that it's not perfumey. Like say the Huda Beauty powder is very perfumed, and some high-end luxury powders are very perfumed. That can actually be bad for your skin. So this one actually I find to be perfectly finely milled to use under my eyes, and it sets my makeup in place, but it doesn't make me look powdery or cakey if I use the right amount. Again, like I said, I don't bake, but I will use my sponge to apply my loose powders underneath my eyes. So what I do is I get a little bit in my cap, just like that. I will press my sponge into what's left in the cap, and then I actually pat it on my hand a little bit just to distribute it evenly on the sponge. And then I look in my mirror, I pat out any creases, and then I stretch out my face again and I gently press the powder into my skin. So I find this method with the damp sponge is sort of a 2-for-1 than the way I did it on this side, where I brushed it on and then patted over with the damp sponge. This, you're patting the product in with the damp sponge, but not in a way like baking where you're actually coating the sponge in powder and then pressing it onto your face and just packing it on and letting it sit. That doesn't look very flattering on me unless I'm using the studio lights or doing portrait photography. So now we've got both eyes that are powdered and looking quite flawless, but you can tell that the Charlotte Tilbury side just makes this spot right here look a little less prominent. So that's something in the property of the powder itself. That's what it's designed to do. The Nikia Joy powder is an excellent powder. I find it has excellent staying power, but it doesn't do as good of a job as the Charlotte Tilbury with making that little ridge that I have under my eyes recede. However, the Nakia Joy powder is absolutely my pick for all over the rest of the face, and that's what we're going to move on to. Before we move on to how I powder the rest of my face and when I powder the rest of my face, we have to talk about where else I put concealer. So you could choose to powder this now, but if it's not in an area that's already creasing, you could leave it until you're putting powder on later. So when this is useful is if you are using a cream bronzer or cream or liquid blush, you might want to just powder your under eyes and then leave it alone so that you don't risk getting powder on your face where you're going to be applying additional cream products, so that it doesn't mess with the application of your cream products. And that's perfectly fine. Actually, I recommend that. The only other thing you might want to powder right now is, like, for instance, what I call my WTF lines. I want to powder those now so that I can lock down the foundation in that area before it has a chance to sort of clump together and collect in that line. So I'm going to use the Nakia Joy powder for this because I find it does a really, really good job of that. I'm going to take a look at my line. And actually, this foundation is actually really great for not collecting in my line. But my trick for buffing out anything that's collected in there before I've set it is I take a fluffy brush like this. And I think this was supposed to be an eyeshadow brush. However, I have very, very small eyes. And so this is way, way too big for me to use as an eyeshadow brush. So I used it for this a couple of years ago. And I found it worked great, and so that's how I use it ever since. So I take a look at my line, and I take my bigger fluffy brush, and I just buff. This has no product on it. This doesn't have powder on it. But I just brush it over my wrinkles, and it just takes what has collected in those lines and redistributes it around, so it's not collected in the lines. And then before it has a chance to recollect in the lines, I take my powder brush, again with what's in the cap, and I just press it in. Now you don't want to use too much powder if you're trying to prevent product from collecting in a deeper line. The more product you put in an area where a deeper line is, the more likely it is going to congeal together later in the day and create a really unflattering line of product on your face. So light layers is the key here. Just like in my foundation video when I talked about the light layers, this works for powder too, light layers. I will link that video down below and up in the cards. So now that I have my forehead and my under eyes powdered, I love, love, love cream bronzer and blush. So this is where I would stop. I would finish up the rest of my makeup. I would do my under eye makeup. I would put on my bronzer and my blush. And then one of the things that you can do when you're using a cream product like a bronzer or blush is use the powder version of the same product to set that into place so you don't use more powder on your face later. That is something that is very, very useful and will increase the staying power of your cream or liquid blush and bronzer products. However, if you are going to go into powder bronzer and powder blush at this point, you can powder the rest of your face. For this, I like to use a bigger, fluffier brush like this. And again, you can either use a pressed powder or a loose powder for this. So this really comes down to preference. If you have a foundation that you love, but on a day you just need maybe a little bit extra coverage, you can actually use a pressed powder foundation over your liquid or cream foundation to add a little bit of coverage and set the makeup all at once. One of the ones I love for this is the Flower Beauty powder. That one is great. Also your MAC powder, the Studio Fix, I think it is. I forget the name. I will pop a picture of it up here. There are also pressed translucent powders that you can use just to set your makeup into place and not add any additional coverage. The Charlotte Tilbury is one of those. There are pressed and loose powders that both claim to sort of blur the look of your pores, such as the Charlotte Tilbury. And there are loose powders that do the same thing. Now I have a T-zone that does get a little oily throughout the day depending on the weather and whether I'm inside in my heat or if I'm outside a lot. I have to sort of decide what my skin is going to be going through that day to think about what kind of powder I need. Now I'm inside today in my heater. The temperature inside my house fluctuates wildly depending on whether or not the heater is on, so I do get a little extra dewy in my house during the day when the heater is on. So I am going to use my Nakia Joy powder to set the rest of my face. I get a little product in the top and then I dip my brush in it, try and work it into the brush a bit, but then I tap off the excess. And then I just start. Now again, where you first put your brush down is where the most product is going to go. So for me right now, recently, I have been placing my brush down first where my mask is going to hit the most. And I just buff this in. Now, when I'm doing my forehead, I try to stay away from where I've already powdered and I go around it. Now, if you dragged your foundation down your neck to get a better match and to avoid that harsh line like I taught you, then make sure you're powdering down here as well. And there we go. So now your powder is on. Are you done? I don't think so. I think something that really takes my look to the smoothest level it could possibly be is by then going back with my beauty blender or my makeup sponge or whatever you're using, and it's nice and damp, and I press it in. And this just sets it all down, makes it melt all together, takes away any excess powder that I might have gotten in one place or another, takes any powderiness down, and just creates this flawless finish. I will zoom you in and show you what we're looking like. So this is what we're looking like. We still have a bit of a glow because that foundation is really great for giving me still a bit of a glowy finish, but I'm no longer tacky. Everything is set. There's no more foundation collected in my WTF line. My under eyes look nice and smooth and not crepey or creasy, but we are all set down with powder. So the other kind of powder you're going to hear about is finishing powders. And you're thinking to yourself, well, isn't it the same thing? No. Finishing powders are designed to be used after all of your makeup is done to add sort of light and reflectivity back into your face. They often have small little pearl or reflective particles in them. They're very finely milled, so they don't actually set your makeup. They will just put this veil on top of your face to either blur it out or to add sort of glow. The Hourglass powders are one of the sort of most famous finishing powders. I didn't bring mine down here. However, I did pick up the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder in the shade Light, and it is actually labeled as a setting powder. I haven't ever set with it yet. I've actually, just because it said glow, I thought I would try it as a finishing powder, and I actually quite like it. I just put a tiny amount of product in the cap, and then I put my big fluffy brush in it and I work it into the big fluffy brush, tap out any excess, and then I just put it where I want that glow back. Now mind you, generally when you're doing this, you're actually going to have the rest of your makeup on, your highlighter, your blush, your bronzer, your eyeshadow, eyebrows. I've done none of those things, but you're gonna have all of that already done. So this is after everything is done. And you can put your finishing powder on before or after your setting spray. If you put it on after your setting spray, oftentimes it will give it a little, especially if it's a glowy one, it'll give you a little bit extra glow. So as I'm just putting this on to where I want that extra glow and that youthful dewiness back into my skin, you can see that I just have a little bit more glow, and it literally just adds this glowiness back to your skin. Now this stuff is awesome. I highly recommend the e.l.f. Halo Glow setting powder. Again, I haven't actually tried this as a setting powder yet. I just immediately whipped it out and used it as a finishing powder, and it worked so great that is how I've been using it. One of the things that you can use a finishing powder for is to take down a boo-boo. So if you put too much highlighter on or too much blush or too much bronzer and you need to blend it out, but you don't want to add any heaviness to your skin by going in with your actual setting powder, take a finishing powder, rub it in with a big fluffy brush and go over the whole area with your finishing powder, and it will help diffuse and blend your too strong of a highlight or too much pigment blush and help diffuse it all out without adding heaviness and powderiness and ultimately cakiness to your skin. You definitely do not want to use a powder foundation for that. If you use a powder foundation to go over a mistake, it's gonna end up looking like a big fat mess, and it's going to be cakey and overly powdery, and just don't do it. Use a finishing powder to take down a highlighter that turned out streaky or a blush that's a little too pigmented. You're really going to like the result. So the next video in this series is going to be about adding some color back to our faces. We're going to talk about bronzer, blush, and highlighter. So if you're interested in that, make sure you go ahead and hit the subscribe button and turn your notifications on to all. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. It helps me out a ton. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and wash your damn hands. Bye. Just choked on my own saliva. And it just picks the chunks.